Hello, this is Kaii Marie, and you're listening to episode number 17, season 1 of the Healing Element Podcast. If you are watching this episode on the Healing Element Podcast YouTube channel, please be sure to like and subscribe. If you are listening by audio, please be sure to download today's episode. Today's topic is a spiritual practice, yoga. Please enjoy. Hello and welcome to the Healing Element Podcast, a weekly discussion giving you the tools to understand and heal from intergenerational trauma. I am your host, Kaii Marie. To find out more information about the topics discussed today, visit kaimarie.com. Hi, this is Kaii Marie, and welcome to the Healing Element Podcast. I'm so excited that you are here with me today. I have a very special guest with me, and before I introduce her, I just want to let you know what the title of our program is, A Spiritual Practice, Yoga. My very special guest, Dea, is going to talk to us a little bit about the spiritual meaning of yoga, and we're going to talk about how this spiritual practice can really help heal our mind, body, and spirit. So before we jump into our topic, I want to introduce you to my very special guest. She is the founder of Spiritual Living by Che and Che Yoga. She's a spiritual mentor, trauma-informed yoga teacher, facilitative mediator, anti-racism trainer, organizer, and legal educator, social justice and movement attorney. Welcome, Dea, to the program. So happy to have you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you. So again, like I said, wanted to jump in today's topic, but I just wanted to briefly talk about how I came across your work was from your Instagram page and just seeing all the work that you're doing in the community. And because of that, I was immediately drawn to it. And you can just see your passion and commitment to our community for the issues that such as racial justice, social justice, and just people beginning their healing journey and learning how they can do that. And that's what really drew me to your work. So I'm so excited to have you here and for us to talk about yoga in a different light than what we really see many times in mainstream media. So we can just dive right in with first getting the meaning of yoga. So what does yoga mean to you?
Let's see. I mean, there's so many different meanings, I guess. And the more that I continue to learn, because, you know, we're forever students, right? You never stop learning. And so the more that I learn about it, the more expansive it becomes and the more humble I become. At this point, I want to say, well, maybe the best way to answer it is kind of like what my journey has been through yoga. I started practicing my own personal practice of yoga almost 20 years ago, when I was in my 20s. And so at that point, I started off thinking it was more of just like a physical exercise that I could do at home. You know, very pragmatic, practical. I was like, I'm a single mother, you know, I need something that I can do at home. And so I started to look for something. And then I was in a bookstore and came across yoga. I was in, you know, Indiana in the Midwest. Yoga was not popular. I didn't know anyone else who did it, especially. And then even when I started going to a yoga studio, there weren't any Black students for the most part. I had never actually met the owner of that studio, but later found out that the owner of the studio is a Black American woman, or was a Black American woman at the time she sold it. But so it started off as kind of just a very generic, you know, looking for an exercise program. And then after going into it more and, you know, feeling the results and the effects and, you know, seeing, you know, I guess feeling this growth and transformation that I would have in those spaces, I continued with it. And as I got older, as life challenges came up, as my life changed, as trauma came up, it became much more of a healing practice. and not just from a physical sense. I think when people think of healing, they think of physical, like to the body, like, will yoga help my back pain, or will it help my, my blood pressure or diabetes? Those are some of the consequences, I think, of what I would frame as spiritual healing, spiritual evolution. And so for me, I think yoga, it has, and I think that as we continue to talk, I'll expand a little bit on what I've learned in my journey, and then as a teacher of yoga and a lifelong student at this point, I think it'll be for the duration of my life that I'm doing this. And so I think that at this point, it's very much a spiritual healing practice that helps you evolve spiritually. And that, I think, is the core of it. And that opens up healing in other areas, in the mind, in the body. But at its core, that's, I believe, where the power, where the expansiveness, where the really, I guess, just power is the best way to describe it right now. I'm missing a word that can really encompass what my view and my experience of it has been. But I think it's phenomenal, and I think it is because of the spiritual power that comes from this spiritual practice.
That's awesome. And I know we're going to kind of dive into this as we go through our conversation today. But I just kind of thinking about how you're explaining like what yoga means to you and the benefits that you have found in your own life. Many of times that seems to kind of get lost, like the spiritual significance of yoga gets lost. And like now this become very popular in the Western world. I don't know how many times I've seen like, try this program, and at the end of it, you can do a split, or you can increase your flexibility, or it's basically all physical. And sometimes sprinkled in there, you'll have some of the spiritual components of it as well. But a lot of it is focused on fit. How does this affect your body? How do you relieve pain or reduce pain? So do you agree with that? Do you think that generally speaking, that spiritual component of yoga that is important is missing from the Western practice?
Oh, I mean, without a doubt. But I would say that I don't say that from a judgmental standpoint, because as I just mentioned, that's what led me into yoga, right? Like that was what my entry was. I will say that when I came into it, and the studio where I came into it, it was not get a yoga booty type of studio where you see now, right? Like even though I came in looking for kind of an exercise program, and I was going from reading about yoga in a book that really only was written by white Americans and only had white Americans in it, and then moving into a studio, it was very different. There was more of a spiritual focus. We had I remember there being yoga teachers there who taught Kundalini yoga and various different aspects in meditation. And even though I didn't explore those at the time at that studio, they were there. Like the deeper message, the deeper meaning was there. It was present. You had people who had been teaching, who were teaching there, who had been practitioners of yoga and teachers of yoga since maybe the 60s. And so it was a different environment. It wasn't Lululemon. It wasn't very commercial. It was like, here, this is yoga. We're exploring the various types of yoga. And so I feel very blessed that I entered into yoga and was called to it at that point, because I do think in some ways the focus, if there's an overemphasis or too much of a focus on the physical benefits of it, when as you begin to explore particularly the Yoga Sutras, and as you start to use the yoga, the physical, the asana practices, you can really start to transform a lot of trauma, a lot of emotional turbulence. You really can become more, you can grow in your mastery of the self, right? Because that's what you're walking towards. But I think that limiting it to, oh, I got to get in my yoga today, like I have to get in my run today, it really limits your growth if that's all you relegate it to. And so, every industry does what it does, right? It's, you know, it's consumerism. It's commercial, you know, they're in business to make money, but for the yoga studios who really focus in and challenge students to go deeper, I think that that is at least closer to what the, you know, Patanjali and what the meaning of it was, how it grew out, how yoga grew as a spiritual practice. And so for me, I try not to be judgmental, but I'm human, so I do have I have an opinion. And so for me, you know, I'm really excited when I see people who are delving into these deeper topics, which, and I think sometimes the reason why people don't is because it requires a truth that is uncomfortable for a lot of students, that's uncomfortable for a lot of teachers. It requires a truth and owning an acceptance of every part of yourself first before you start to open this up to other people. And that's not something to take lightly. And so I think it's hard to present it as that. It's not popular. Even with the work that I do and in the way that I present it, not everyone likes the style. Not everyone, you know, comes back to classes like when I was doing them in person, but that's okay because, you know, the phrase is that there's, you know, one yoga, but many paths. So whatever path you get to it on, you know, just keep growing is what, you know, my concern would be, is that if you're limiting yoga and you're restricting it to just, okay, I want my butt to look good in these pants, that's really not honoring the traditions of it, or it's relegating it into a very, very small place when really it is a phenomenal practice, a phenomenal philosophy, a phenomenal kind of lifestyle, really.
Right. And it's so interesting, like when you said about just like the yoga booty. I think there is something called like yoga, like some type of program that's actually called yoga booty. No judgment. I'm just saying I think that exists.
Yeah.
And I think too, like, so if you are coming to a space such as yoga that has so many different, can affect your body in so many different ways. And if you happen to focus on one area, let's say I want to sculpt my arms or my abs or something, this could be the opportunity that you look deeper, right? You could say, well, why, you know, with all of this that yoga has to offer, why am I only focused on the physical? Just kind of ask yourself that question and kind of see where that kind of leads you. You know, is there a reason why there's just this sole focus on something external when this is a practice that can also offer you something for your internal being? And so that could also be that journey, just like what you had said at first. It was like this physical part, and, you know, I'm a single mom. I want to be able to, you know, be in shape, and this is the way that I can do it. And then as you began to develop your own practice, it kind of expanded into, oh, wow, there's this whole new world that exists, and there's also healing that I can also benefit from.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree with that. I think the only, with the depiction of yoga in the West, and I don't know if this if the Western view is expanding worldwide, which we see oftentimes, right? Like,
yes,
the U.S. will you know, take something, appropriate something as its own,
right.
and send out, you know, a very shallow or watered down or you know, whitewashed version of it. And so, you know, I have to say, I learned in the U.S. and so there is still a gap there. I've had a couple teachers who were from India, and so that was great, but I was still here. It was in the United States. So I think that, you know, we have to be mindful of that and understand what we don't know, and reach out and try to understand not only the true roots and origin of it, respecting and honoring the culture that it comes from. The same way that, you know, I think as Black Americans, we're very sensitive to that appropriation and the taking. And I think it's really important that we honor that. And I think that, to your point, which is what you just said, that, you know, it's, you know, asking yourself why you're only restricting this to a physical practice. I think that there also needs, for whoever the teacher is, there needs to be an intentional focus on on bringing up and speaking of it as a spiritual practice. It really is important, because so many people who aren't familiar with it will still come up to me or inquire with me and say, is yoga helpful to help you lose weight? And I'm like, I'm always hesitant with that. And so I don't really focus on what the physical benefits are. I'm like, you come to the class, or, you go to YouTube, you watch it, see how you feel afterwards. Like, I can't promise you outcomes, and, we're always restricted by what you're doing in business, because, you can't promise that you're going to get physical or, or medical benefits from yoga. But for me, it's the whole purpose of it, in which I'm very honest about whenever anyone asks me. I'm like, I have a very spiritual take. I'm getting at the spiritual roots of yoga. So, for me, you're going to see a little bit of progress, whenever you come in, because this is all connected. But, I'm explicitly focused on the spiritual in my live classes and in the workshops that I do online right now. So for me, it's never a separate experience. I don't just focus on the mental or just, the physical. It's all encompassing for me. And so I think that it's on us as teachers to make sure that even if we don't feel capable of teaching it, that we at least present information that lets people know this is way bigger than just what I'm presenting to you, and encourage students, not being possessive over students, encouraging them to explore yoga and offerings with other teachers who may be able to take them deeper or show them, another side of it. And that can be really challenging, I think, when you're a broke yoga teacher, right? like when you're not making much money, but
don't go.
Right. Like, yes, stay here, keep coming here. I mean, but the thing about it is, and I definitely, starting out, I didn't have any money when I started, up this business and classes, and I still wouldn't say that I'm wealthy at by any measure or definition right now. But I reached those points, and it was like, okay, is this about me, or is it about their journey? And ultimately, the answer that I reached is that it's about their journey. I'm offering this as a service. I need to, to live my life. I need to be able to eat so that I can continue to do it. But at the same time, it doesn't serve me to be possessive over them. It's unhealthy. It's not right relationship, which is what, the Yoga Sutras focus on, and what the core of yoga really is built around. And so I think that for me, I reconciled it with, even if I had 100 students following me, in the city in Baltimore, there's no way that I could be a good teacher to 100 students in one room, right? There's no way. And so I think that it's important that people understand that there is a teacher for everyone. We just have to make sure that as we're introducing the information, as we're introducing the practice, that we're not limiting it or restricting it to the way that we do it, but that we're honest about there's so many different features of this, and that maybe you invite a teacher to your class, which is what I was hoping to do before the pandemic hit. Yoga to sleep is one of the examples, like Pamela, the teacher who does that. Like, I noticed that some of my students were having problems with sleeping. This is what she does, though. That's not what I do. And so I was like, oh, let me see if Pamela will come. And so I think that, really making sure that, you're helping the students see possibilities and growth opportunities that extend even beyond you. And once people know that, you actually care about their growth as well, you develop a relationship that way. And different times of your life, you're going to need a different type of practice, is what I found in the last 20 years. And that is even within a week. Within a week, I might be like, very anxious, and so I need this type of practice, or I may feel like I'm in some depressive energy, and so I need this type of practice. And so it's kind of like, be fair, be in right relationship with even your students, so that it doesn't become some kind of a competition, or you're not possessive, understanding that you provide this service, but it is bigger than you.
Right. And I when you're talking about being a teacher, it made me think. So when I first started teaching some years ago, there was this pressure of like, to get, because I'm more so of the spiritual part, like the healing, the therapeutic, the restorative, which is not like, to be honest, it's not sexy. It's not wearing like, you know, typical like little clothes. Like I'm not going to do that on, on my Instagram page. It's about healing. It's about going inward. And so initially when I started, back in 2000, I think it was like 2017, started to teach and kind of publicize my teaching, I kind of got like, well, who's going to want to do like this inner work? Like, how do I market that? Right. So I was within my own self had this battle of, well, maybe I should do like weight loss, like, because if you manage your stress, then you won't eat as much. Like somehow I was trying to say like, how can this, I'm gonna make this make sense. Right. So I would try to, but although, and when I would post about it, in all honesty, it wasn't me. I was trying to promote this concept that wasn't even what I truly resonated with, but it was this need of like, I gotta get students, I have to grow my business. And so at that point, I thought to do that, I would have to compromise. And so part of the learning process was to stand in your truth and say, okay, this is what this practice means to me. The spiritual component, the healing component, that's the truth of what this practice has brought to me. Yes, you know, maybe being in shape or what have you has also been a benefit, but what really resonates to me is the healing aspect. And so I guess I just say this to teachers, if you're just starting out, and it does seem like we are very much so in this physical part of yoga, it works so much better when you do stand in your truth. And if yours is coming from a lens of healing and spirituality, I say run with that, and you will definitely grow into that. And you will attract those type of students that need that type of work.
I would agree with that too. That's been my experience as well. And it started up slow, and you know, it took me going inward and finding strength inside, because you know, like I said, I was not in a good financial standing when I started my work, when I opened up my classes. And so there were times where, you know, things were just really, really tight. And then, you know, kind of going in and finding my source of strength and my reserves inward, and staying connected and using this practice that had helped me so often. In every other situation, it helped me. Now, does that mean that I could ignore the world? No. It doesn't. Right. Like, you know, right. You have to also, there's a balance that you have to maintain there. So there needed to be planning about, how do I make this work practically? And, you know, as a practical matter, but also making sure that, you know, I'm not compromising my principles, you know, what right living, what right relationship is, in order to do this. And so, you know, there were times where there were temptations, and maybe I moved that route, and then spirit was like, no, I told you. And, you know, and I could, you know, my family, my friends, my daughter, like it's really clear. She's like, hey, you know what happened the last time you deviated, like, and so I'm like, I know. And so, you know, you get these signs, and it's like, all right, okay, I'm not going to wait for it to get any worse. Let me get back to where this is, where the core of this is, and where my commitment to this lies. And so, I mean, I think that it is important to be realistic and understand that, you know, you're not going to become, you know, necessarily a millionaire. You know, you're not going into this for money. You do need it to live, and you have to be realistic about that. But minimizing kind of this capitalist take on yoga, I think, is really important. This competition, this scarcity, there isn't enough. I got to get as many students, you know, right. I need to, you know, manipulate. I'm going to, you know, create this yoga teacher training because I can get paid more, even if it's not offering, you know, real valuable education to the students. And, you know, that's a concern. I have no complaints about the yoga teacher training that I went through. But I do think that, like, sometimes I see things and I'm like, this doesn't look similar to what I have. And I wonder what, you know, how deep this is. And, you know, is this a certified program? Because a lot of times, you know, and I know there's a big debate in the yoga world about certification. And right. But I do think that the standards are important, because if you are planning, let's say you do have to take that option of going into a gym, and teaching
Right.
yoga, you're not going to be able to if you don't have like a Yoga Alliance
Mm-hmm.
certificate. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that, you know, there's always a balance, right? You can't just go
Right.
totally spiritual and say, I'm going to give away all of my, you know, worldly belongings, especially if, you know, you are a Black American who comes from
Yeah.
a very oppressed and, and, you
Yeah.
know, economically oppressed, you know, culture. Like, that's
Yeah.
not realistic. You have to eat.
Right.
But, you know, also understanding that, you know, you shouldn't be compromising everything and
Mm-hmm.
watering this down, because I think there are spiritual the same way that there are worldly consequences if you ignore, you know, what you need in the material world. There are spiritual consequences if, you know, you are ignoring what is the glaring purpose and you know, source and light of this as well. So that's been in my experience.
Right. And so can you speak more to that spiritual part of yoga that we may not see as much? You know, is that something that kind of helped you during those periods where it's just like, oh, I don't know if I can continue to do this. So can you share with us a little bit about the spiritual part of yoga and how that has helped you along your journey?
Yeah, and so I can do that, and ever since I saw your question, I've been kind of like, how do I explain something, you know,
It's
because
so
like,
layered, right?
yeah, well, and it's layered, and by definition, the spiritual isn't something that you capture. It's not concrete,
Mm,
right? It's
yeah.
not. And so it's more of an experience, right? Like,
Hmm.
you go into this studio and maybe it feels more like, you know, it smells like, I don't know, bodies.
Yeah.
And you know that it's like, oh, this is a Bikram, or it's a hot yoga studio.
Right,
Um,
right.
and then, you know, you go another place and it's like, okay, wait, the energy here just feels different. And so
Hmm.
it's and so I've questioned how you best describe that. And I'm thinking about kind of the responses that some of my students have had to me.
Hmm.
And I think it comes down to, as a teacher, it comes down to what type of space you're holding, what type of energy you are in,
Hmm.
yourself,
Hmm.
how open you are to that, how you view yourself as a teacher.
Hmm.
But for me individually, as a student of yoga, I think that the best way to describe what it was for me is to kind of talk about, and I think this will kind of lead us to some of the other topics that we'll talk about.
Hmm.
I one of the most one of them, and I wouldn't say it's the only one, but one of the most traumatic things that have happened to me in my life would be when I had to make a decision um, at the last job that I had as a full-time attorney, full-time permanent attorney. And so I was working for a nonprofit. It was a white-led nonprofit that worked with the homeless population um, out here in the DMV area. And so, I mean, just, I had been there for so long. I knew there was something wrong when I went into the organization. I knew it. And because I had already been doing this work on myself
Hmm.
with yoga, right? Like, I'm
Hmm.
like in touch
Right,
with my spirit. I'm like, something's off, something's off. And
right.
so I spent, you know, 4 years there. And toward the end, it was like, I could just see harm happening. And, you know, I'm part of that community, right? Like, you know, I grew up on welfare, you know, my family's
Hmm.
poor. I was on welfare as a single mother, you know, all of those things, like, you know, all of the trappings of oppression,
Hmm.
socioeconomic oppression,
Hmm.
um, all of that, you know, racial violence, racial trauma, like disparity, you know, all of that. I experienced that. And so in becoming an attorney from that background, I knew I was going into social justice work. I knew I wanted to go into movement work, and but I had to eat, right? Like, so
Yeah.
you have to get a job, and you have to get a job
Hmm.
within this system so that you
Hmm.
can feed yourself. And so, um, with a move to the East Coast, you know, it's the cost of living is no joke out here. You know,
Hmm.
I stayed in this place for about 4 years, and it just got to a point where I was like, I can no longer look at myself in the mirror and love myself if I stay here any longer. I can't keep fighting every single solitary day. It's weakening me more and more and more. And meanwhile, the people who I'm here trying to help are also suffering in the same process. And so it really came to a point where it was like, okay, you have to separate yourself from this. Like you're being, you know, repeatedly wounded and traumatized in this process, because you're also likewise being oppressed right along with them as you try and stand for them. And so that was really kind of a, once I left, and it wasn't just that I left, it was that there was a very obvious intention to push me out as I started to confront proactively a lot of the issues that were happening there.
And that just adds to the trauma. That just even
oh
more.
yeah,
That, yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, oh yeah. And it wasn't just a white and black thing. It was that, you know, it's white led, but then there were also people of color there who, you know, were too afraid to stand with me so that there could be, you know, some type of change or shift. And so, and I won't minimize it. The consequences are harsh when you do that. When you take a stand like that, the consequences are harsh. And I think that we see that much more commonly now. People distance themselves from you. They don't, you know, it's like there's a self-preservation rather than realizing that there really is a lot of strength and unity for standing what is right, for, you know, to put it in yoga terms, for having right relationship. And it's not a comfortable space to be in. And so I had already been through a lot before that came to this juncture where I was like, okay, I've worked in the material world very, very hard to get to this place. Most of the people who, you know, I want to say 100% of the people who I grew up with had never had these worldly privileges to become an attorney and do this type of work. So kind of, you know, feelings of guilt. Am I, you know, am I betraying the people who, you know, I've come out here to try and help, like this community who I love and who, you know, who I want to support. And so there were a lot of questions that I had. And then on top of that, I kind of had to realize that there were a lot of ways in which I gave up my power in that situation and in many others. And so that was kind of like the start of, let's say, a two-year process of spiritual evolution, because I did, you know, I did leave that place. I did. And that meant that, you know, I'm from a poor family. That meant I have nothing. That means I don't have any money. And it also meant that because I addressed things and started to be very proactive and very assertive towards the end, it also meant that as a whistleblower, I'm not able to necessarily find another job. Like, yeah, I mean, it's very, very real consequences. Like, you know, black or white, people don't want to touch you. And so it wasn't that I was like mad in love with my legal career. It was like, I viewed that as also kind of a stand in a position that the divine put me in to do work. And I treated my law practice in that same way, which is why it was so hard for me to stay in a situation where I saw policies and treatment of clients that was just racist, and that was disrespectful, and that was oppressive, and that was enabling, and that was not healthy at all. And, you know, where it kind of felt vampiristic to a degree, where, you know, you're benefiting and you're getting a ton of money for people who are living in an abandoned hospital, you know, whole families. And so it was a very difficult time. And so I want to say that was kind of more recently, that was one among many. That was one trauma that came up. Like for me personally, what I had been a part of, because I had been a part of that organization, I tried to minimize the damage, but I was still part of it. I was eating every day off of the money that was coming into that organization that wasn't going to, you know, the clients who we were helping. Like, so or trying to help. And so there was a lot of trauma that I had. There was a lot of pain. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of, how did I get to this place? Is there a place for me to actually do this work, the work that needs to be done as an attorney? Am I going to be restricted by the system, by, you know, the rules, by, you know, what the world has shaped as this is what you can do in this container? And despite the fact that people view law practice and attorneys as like these really powerful entities, and you can do everything. You can do everything that the system that it's been created in allows for. Because it's a worldly, it's a structure, right? Like concrete things have finite and they're defined, right? And so for me, as I did this work, I want to say an example of what that felt like for me. It was grueling. There were times where I was like, let me back up. Most people think about going to yoga to feel good. I'm having stress at work. I'm going to go to yoga to feel good. Yoga, the power of yoga comes in when you are at a really, really tough place, when you don't know what to do, when you're afraid, when you're stressed out, when you're anxious, you know, when you feel like you can't breathe because oppression is falling all over you and everything is falling apart. That's when you go to yoga, right? Like that's when you go to yoga. And I don't mean go to a yoga class necessarily. I mean, you start to do this in your own space. This pandemic, for example, like this is what you do. There are many times where I was either on my mat, where I was at my altar. I'm just praying because I don't know what else to do. You know, you go inward. And so I think that sometimes there's an expectation with going to seek out yoga that you go there, you have a teacher who, you know, does nice, you know, assists or, you know, adjustments or whatever. And, you know, they help you feel good and they tell you good things. And it's this very, very shallow view of it that's kind of enabling and codependent a little bit, instead of teaching people, okay, you should go home and do this, because at the hardest times, yoga, that's when yoga is really, you're going to really understand the depth, the meaning, what it means for transformation through yoga, what it means to transmute energy. And it's a process. So I had stuff that I had not dealt with from childhood, like early childhood, that started to come up as I went to my mat during this particular time of my life. And all of that stuff, like it came up. I mean, it seemed like it came up a new thing every week.
That's that healing work, right? It's just like, well, I thought I was making it through, and then other stuff started popping up, like, wait, what is this about?
Right. And so sometimes when I talk about it, I think of it as an onion, right?
Yeah.
Like it's easier. The layers at the top, they're a little bit thinner and you pull them back a little bit. And it's like, okay, whew, made it through that. And so for me, like kind of the outer layer of this, you know, kind of this oppression that I had experienced on the job, the racism, discrimination, the oppression I experienced on the job, that was the top layer for me. And so as I started to like work through that and kind of accept where I gave up power, where I let fear control me and didn't do and act in the ways that I could have and that I need to going forward. And then the ways in which, you know, people were just, you know, the system was just doing what it does, right? Like it's just this really imbalanced, like toxic thing, this toxic culture that, you know, that I was born into. So it's both. It's like, it's not that it can impose on you in any way that it wants. Half of that is that we're allowing that, right? I allowed it. I stayed there. I was there for it, right? I was here for that for a while. And that's a question about self-love though too, right? Like it gets to really, really deep questions. And then so as you peel that back, why did I tolerate that? Yeah, the system is messed up, but why did I tolerate that? You know? And then it's like, okay, well, was it money? No, it really wasn't money, because I'm not the type who cares about money, or else I would have never left, right? Then you dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and then you start to look at the way that the culture has conditioned you, and then you start to look at, you know, how, you know, your family history and what your family has been through and how that conditioned them, and the, you know, the problems that you may have in the relationships within your family, and where there's, you know, trauma or abuse there. And so then you start to see that they're just, every layer has the same issues to them, right? It's this imbalance. It's very much an imbalance. It's very much a reactive approach to everything. It's, rather than being proactive, it's being more concerned and more consumed by worldly things rather than relying on the internal spiritual, and understanding that the world, the physical material world, is just a piece of this. It's only half of it. And I believe, when I look back at world history, at Black American history, you know, I believe that a lot of our strength in even getting to this place in life has been because of the spiritual connection that we have as Black people, as people of color. Like, that is something that when we actually harness that, when we actually own that, when we stand in this spiritual existence and this spiritual being that we are underneath this body, that's where power, that's where change has come from in every turn. And, you know, I had been studying movements and history and trying to learn this all the time. But, you know, for some reason, even though I've been practicing yoga at the very same time, it didn't come to me. It didn't come to me until shortly before kind of this, I'll call it a spiritual crisis, because that's what I think it was. And so this kind of vision, kind of I guess I'll call it my spiritual assignment, came to me right before this crisis of spiritual consciousness came, right? Like that is when it happened. It was like, I was, you know, in a very centered place. I got the message that this is what you need to do, Dea, based on everything that you know, I've built you up. I've given you all of this. This is what you need to do. And I was like, okay, I'll wait. And then boom, spiritual crisis comes. It's time for you to do this now, because I gave it to you, because you're ready now. And so, but as part of that, in order to do that assignment, in order to do that work, you have to do your work first. I had to work on me first. I had to be willing to face and experience and look at the trauma and look at the abuse and look at the ways that I cheated myself and look at the ways where I tolerated on hateful treatment or abuse, where I walked toward it, right? Or, you know, out of fear, out of concern, out of attachment to worldly things. And so that's a hard process, but as best as I can describe it, and, you know, my workshops go a little bit more into depth and provide a framework of how you start to uncover this based on what my process was, right? It's not that everybody's going to be the same. It's like, here is an example of what I went through over this 2-year period, from the time at which it became clear to me that I was betraying myself, that I was ignoring the spiritual part of my being, and I needed to correct that. And I needed to first heal before I could move into position so that I could actually, you know, work according to that assignment, before I could start to live in or manifest the spiritual gifts that, you know, that my spirit was born into this world with. And so that healing piece it's crucial. It's crucial to gaining strength. It's crucial to letting go of fear. It's crucial to letting go of all these attachments that hold you here and that make you afraid of potentially losing your life, in order to move the world or your community to a right relationship, to equality, to a more harmonious existence. And so the healing piece. So when, you know, you approached me about the podcast, I'm like, oh, like healing, that's the core of it. You have to start there, because I don't think, like, in this time right now, we see all of these suggestions about, let's do this, let's do that, let's do this. And it's like, if you're coming from a very wounded place, you're not going to be able to see things clearly. If you're highly emotional, if you're hurt, you know, you're not going to be able to see things clearly. I don't know that any solution to any proposed solution to any problem has ever been the right one if you're coming out of a place of, I need to continue to oppress, or I'm wounded and I want retribution or revenge, or I want what they have. Like, it, you know, there's so many different layers to it. But I think that being centered, being grounded, being connected to spirit, understanding how we're all one is important, because if you lose sight of that, somebody always ends up hurt. Somebody always ends up oppressed. And that ultimately compromises everybody's existence. And we don't oftentimes think about what harm comes to oppressors in the system. There's a lot, like there's some serious wounding there, right? And so I think that's not a comfortable place as a Black person. People don't want to hear that. People are uncomfortable with that, right? It's like, no, like we have been, and I'm not lessening that. And there is some very specific healing that we have to do. But I will say that we aren't as distant from our souls, from our spirit, because of the position that we've been in. I think that we are that much closer, right? When I think about my parents and my grandparents, and how deeply spiritual they all were.
Mm-hmm.
And that kept them strong.
Mm-hmm.
That is where the strength of oppressed people comes from.
Right.
That attachment and understanding that these worldly things are just that, and you have
Mm-hmm.
to let them go, and there are things that are more important. That is, I think, where the strength of every movement has come from, understanding that there's something deeper than this, and it's not about going to go get more guns and killing someone and
Mm-hmm.
seizing power, because you understand that power is corruption and it corrupts everyone. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you balance that out? How do you fight against that? You have to go to the spiritual. You have to.
Right.
What sustained me through that oppression and kind of a lot of the stuff that I went through was this spiritual connection, without a doubt, because there was nothing else. I
Mm-hmm.
had a support system of people who didn't know each other all over the country, who just, who were my sincere and genuine friends. So community is a very important piece of it. But at the
Mm-hmm.
end of the day, it was me going inward. It was me focusing on embracing the lessons that I needed to learn from a spiritual perspective, understanding that, there is a place where you have a balance of energies, where you have a spiritual being, and where that healthy place is. And that's where you then begin to act from. And so I feel like that was a lot.
No, that's good. That's
But
good. No, that's really good. And I'm so happy that you spelled it out that way, because that the other question I wanted to get to is people that are listening that are either on their healing journey, starting it no matter where you are, whether it be racial or otherwise, because just as you explained through your story, that it is layered. So the first part of that, peeling back those layers, was what you were experiencing at your job. And as you went deeper and deeper, went to kind of the heart of the matter of, why did why did I stay in this job so long? Why did I do this? Asking those whys to find out more about yourself. And so I think that is part of this whole healing experience, especially when we talk about healing from racial trauma. Just kind of beginning to just ask ourselves why, without being judgmental to ourselves, but just starting to ask why. And as you start asking yourself those questions, you will get answers. Whether you want to say spirit, source, what have you, will begin to speak to you and say, well, this is where this is stemming from. Then you're like, oh, it's stemming from there? Then that means you got to go there.
Yep.
And then once you go there, it's like, well, why did I start doing this? Well, when you look a little bit deeper now. And so all of that is going to definitely take you right back to when you were first starting to form your concept of reality or relationships with other people, which was in your childhood. And so I think that spiritual work that you're talking about is so important, especially for everybody, right? But especially for people that have been oppressed and have faced continuous trauma.
Yep.
I can't stress enough how important it is to create spaces in which you can begin to heal and do that internal work, because that is the way that you will be able to really understand what's going on around you. Without that, it will be very confusing, not really understanding. And not saying it's going to be easy, but you will better know, how do I position myself to in this type of society, and what is the work that I have to do?
Yeah. And what you should be striving for, right?
Right.
One of the things that I keep seeing is that, it's especially right now, people are like, okay, Black businesses, Black Wall Street, this is where we need to go. And I'm like, yeah, is it though? Because we've actually had some of that before, right? But we're still in the same system, and we were still part of a chain that had oppression in it. So maybe, the person that a lot of people had to deal with was, you actually going to deal with a Black face, but somewhere in their chain of supply, somewhere in their business line, you best be sure they were still being oppressed economically. And so it's like, is it that we're tied to and we're attached to capitalism, which we know at this point is oppressive to other countries. It's oppressive within our own country, right?
Right.
And so I think that, oftentimes it's like you have to start challenging a lot of what you've been conditioned to believe is normal. And trying to do that without a spiritual grounding you might feel like you are going insane. And there were times where I thought I was.
Yeah.
And it was like, you have to be grounded, understanding that there is something bigger at play. There's a whole other world. There's a whole other power here. It's not just the world. If you have empowered, and I felt like this at times when, I was scared to leave that job. I was giving the white people in that organization way too much power, way too much power, as if they controlled my life. And that's never been the case. And you understand that from a spiritual perspective in a way that you will never reach if you are only thinking in worldly terms. You can begin to see and create opportunities and solutions and different ways of being and different ways of addressing things from a spiritual standing, a grounded spiritual standing. That directly has an impact on what your worldly existence looks like, and how much you suffer there, and how much you tolerate there. And so I think that, without that connection, it's not just how do we move or change places within this system. It's not that. It's understanding that this culture, this system, and I view white supremacy as being a worldwide conditioning. It's understanding what that is and how reliance on that, and thinking that this capitalist, society, which has not always been, right? Like, we forget that there were different ways before this. Right. So we oftentimes limit ourselves to what's going on in the world. Is so important as we start to move through a healing process, that we understand that we've been ignoring, the core of who we all are individually, and as within, maybe even your family, your community, as a larger society, and as the world. And so I think that that's what's going to have to happen. It's uncomfortable, and it seems like, so intangible that it makes people nervous, because they're so used to working with what you can see, what you can touch, what you can feel, and within this structure that we were taught. And so I think it really is challenging that. I wouldn't suggest that people start there. Right. But something that you said made me think. I'm like, no, it's important to realize that, it's both. It only works well together if you have both in balance, right? You have to have the spiritual, you have to have the worldly. The spiritual has to inform what we're producing and creating in the world. Otherwise, harm happens, right? We're too far on this kind of external masculine energy, and it's toxic. And so if you're too far on the external masculine side and it's become imbalanced and toxic, that means that the feminine side also has. So that means that everybody has to heal, right? Right. We both have to. You have to heal both sides, right? And so not even just in terms of gender, but in the fact that we both have, each of us, regardless of gender, have masculine and feminine energies, and you have to explore what that looks like. And so I want to say that one of the places that I think in a prior interview, somebody asked me, where do you start? Where would you suggest other people start in this healing journey? And my answer to that is, first start by looking at your relationships with other people. And it's not just romantic, because everybody wants to look at that. Everybody wants to talk at that. Nah, that's not necessarily what it is. You may look there and you may see a pattern there, that you see a pattern with your family. You may see the same pattern in your job and work life, in your friendships, with your children. Like, really look at those, and where you see there are imbalances, where there are all these struggles, where there is a lot of, what trauma bonds is what you can call it, where you guys are just basically, reacting off of each other's, trauma. Looking at all of those, and if you're seeing that you got problems in all of them, you got healing to do in you. It's not the other person. Right. It's you. Right. It's you. You're very much attracting these experiences. Like they say, you're attracting this so that you can start to heal from it. So once you sit back and you start to examine these relationships, and you really look for what is the thread, what is this, that you're the same, you're the thing that's connecting all of these things, right? Like it's you. So you have to do work. What are you doing in each of those that is perpetuating harmful situations? Right. And those are your relationships, and so you're the core of it. It's not that it's everyone else. And that's relationships regardless of who. It doesn't matter what the race is. You have to be honest with what you are tolerating and what you are projecting or inserting into your relationships. And so I think that that's probably the simplest way. Like, you start there, to just give one answer. And then once you start to really be curious, like, I wonder why people react to me this way. What am I doing that has multiple people in different environments who don't know each other reacting to me this way? Where am I self-centered? Do I feel like I'm always the victim? Do I feel like the world is against me? Do I feel like, somebody's always moving the goalpost so I can't get ahead? That's a victimization energy. And it's like, wait, why do you think you don't have any power? You're human just like this other person is. Yeah, there's a system, but you still have power as much as you're willing to exert. Is it that you're staying a victim because you don't want to give up an attachment to something? And so I think that, a lot of it is just habits. We're attached to certain habits. We've been conditioned a certain way. We don't want to give up existing in this way, because in order to shift, it requires an acknowledgement that there is something wrong with you and there's work that you need to do. And that's an uncomfortable place for everybody to accept. But if you want things to get better, not only for you individually, but to also grow towards being empowered, that is the internal work. That is the introspection. That is looking at the self and examining the self, not just what you want to see, which sometimes is your imagination of what you'd like yourself to be.
True. That's so true.
But accepting you, the not so pretty, that hurt person, that little girl, that little boy who's hurt, who was abused, who still hasn't healed from that, who hasn't went back to think, wait, why did mom do this to me? Or why did this other person do this to me? Oh, it's because they had their own trauma. It's because they've went through their own. It's because, they are unhealed in some way. So I can't take that as it being something wrong with me. They're reacting to, their own conditioning and the time during which they were living and what they experienced, especially if you think back to, the generation that was going through, like, I always think back to my parents' generation. They were going through desegregation. And so it literally went from, white people who you had some distance from because maybe you were able to go to a Black school with a Black teacher, to you now have a white teacher who hates you and you're 5 years old. So, what does that do to your parents? And how do they, especially if they've never had a chance to heal? And I would say in large numbers, this is probably the first generation that has had space and time to do that. That has had a pandemic to stop and spend time at home and start to try and uncover this, sift through this, pull this up, remove the layers back, and get a clear understanding of everybody as an individual instead of you being subject to somebody else's control, like us looking at everybody, including our parents, because there's a lot of wounding around family. There's a lot of wounding around that. In not just Black Americans, in every race and every culture, there's a lot of wounding around misunderstanding, why your parents interacted with you or engaged with you in the way that they did. And there's, tons of research and a lot more coming out about that now. But a lot of it comes from like this conditioning, that this white supremacist conditioning and anti-Blackness that has sunk in, that we've all absorbed. We've all absorbed it worldwide. And where you are on this scale, of whiteness versus Blackness kind of defines where, your wounding is. And so I think that those would be the kind of places where I would say start looking at the relationships first, being honest with what you're doing within them, and understanding that you are the common denominator in all the relationship problems that you have. That's the first place, and owning that. So that I'm going to leave it there because I just keep talking.
I think that's great. And I wanted to say, as we start to wind down our program for today, what you're what you're saying is so on point. And initially, I just want to say when I reached out to you, because right now I was in the process of recording for season 2 of the podcast, but during our conversation, I was like, no, her message is needed right now. Like, around September time of this year, this conversation most likely will still be relevant, right?
Yeah.
But right now, I thought it was so timely. And just everything that you're providing here today is extremely important because we are hurting it. As a country, we are hurting, and specifically as Black Americans. I mean, as you said, like we've been in constant survival mode for so long that the concept of sitting back and saying, okay, let me look at my relationships. Like there was no time for that. It was just kind of like, we got to make it through the day. I got to make sure the kids are safe. I got to make sure mama's safe, daddy's safe. And that it was just living day to day. And I think we are in a challenging yet beautiful moment in which now we can start to take that time. There's so many beautiful healers like yourself who are holding space for people to begin their healing journey. Not only when you heal, does it empower you and strengthen you, but you're also helping the next generation, which is what this podcast is about. How do we stop this cycle of pain? Which I think you did a beautiful job of showing that it starts with you owning where you are, doing that self-work, and then growing from there. And then the next generation, you can instill in them everything that you've learned from doing that work. So, I mean, I'm just like so pleased and excited and thankful and honored to have this conversation. I think it's so necessary because I think that is a lot of times when we've had so much trauma, it's like, where do I even start? That can feel overwhelming. And the fact that you said, you know what, just look at the relationships around you. You don't have to start at trying to fix society. First start with mom, dad. First start with cousin. First start with maybe if you have children, start there, work on those. What are you learning from those relationships? So I think that I can't express to you enough how timely, necessary this conversation is. And I really hope people that are listening, people that are in the space of healing, that maybe are yoga teachers or light workers, that if you are working with people of color, that you understand the type of space that's necessary to create safe spaces for them to begin to do that healing work as well. Because whether we like it or not, we are all in this together. So that's the reality of it. And so, so I definitely wanted to thank you for sharing this message of your journey. And I wanted to ask you too, as we start to close today, is there any other messages that you would like for our listeners to have, ones that are, whether it be their own personal trauma, racial trauma, but anything that you would definitely want to leave the listeners with?
There isn't one thing, I guess, for people who are starting. I think that the hardest part for me was, as I started to uncover uncomfortable truths about myself, maintaining self-love and what that means, right? Meaning that you're going to find some stuff out about yourself that's ugly. It's not going to feel good. And that's where the physical practices, that's where ritual practices of asanas come in. That's where balancing that out, knowing that it's not only you who's going to make mistakes and who acts ugly and who has some ugly history, it's everybody else too. And understanding that that is where compassion comes in, right? You've been in some trash energy. They're going to be in some trash energy. And we have to understand that we are all at different levels of uncovering the need to heal and healing, and being patient with that, but not tolerating abuse in the process of that, right? Being patient with yourself, not abusing yourself in the process. Being patient with others, not accepting abuse from them. And so I think that it's really important. That's where breathing practices, that's where, the asana practice, that's where meditation comes in. As these truths come up, going to those so that you can make it through, stopping the process of everything coming up at once, and pausing and working through that one thing that came up that day. using the practice to help move that through, to change that energy, to transform it. That's kind of where we talk so much about, okay, yeah, you need to start doing this work. You need to pull it up. You need to face that ugly stuff.
Right.
It's like, but it hurts. And like, I remember going through that. I had knots throughout my breasts that just have slowly gone away as I work through the trauma. Right. I had physical responses to this stuff coming up in my body. And so I think that that's when it's important to then pull back on this physical piece, right?
Yeah.
Understanding you are not going to solve or fix or sort through all of this all in one day. If you need somebody to help guide you through it, there's me, and I have like my workshops that are spiritual healing, and I guess I didn't even mention them. They're the spiritual healing and activism workshops, which have the initial focus on the individual primarily, and that's what all of that entire workshop is, just self-exploratory and leading people in a framework. But there are tons of other people who are doing this work, who have grief circles, who have yoga of 12-step recovery. Like there's so many different forms that this could take. Codependence Anonymous, where there are these circles where you get together and you get to do self-exploration in safe spaces. The other thing to yoga teachers, I would say, is be realistic about the space that you're creating. That's just what it is. Whether you're whatever your race, especially if you're a white person, be very honest about whether or not you can provide this space to people. Right. Especially if they have to be honest. Whoever has to be honest about where they are in their healing. If you have not done healing, and you're a white person, you have not done healing specifically around racial trauma and the problems of white supremacy and how you've manifested that and how your culture has created and manifested that, then you probably are not capable of holding space for people of color to work through this. You have to be honest about that. As a Black person, if you have not worked through your racial, or you're not aware of the healing that you need to do around white supremacy and white people and whiteness, you are not in a position to hold space on these topics, because you may end up doing more harm in trying to do that before you've done your own work. And I think that would be kind of what I'd leave it for the individuals, and also for, the yoga teachers as well. You got to do your work. You have to like sort through your shit before you can start trying to guide people to sort through their shit. You have to start that process. You're not going to be finished. You have to start that process and be fairly comfortable along that process before you can hold space for someone else to start doing their work.
Right. Beautifully said. And so, Dea, if people want to know more about you and the beautiful work you are doing, how do they reach out to you?
So let's see, I need to update my website, because like I do everything for my business. And we had mentioned that before, but for right now, like you can find out a lot of information about me and the programs that I do at cheyoga.org, CHEYOGA.org. I have all of my most current information on my Instagram page, which is CHE_YOGA_. I also have Facebook, which is Spiritual Living by Che, but it's still, I think you can just find it on Facebook. That's the easiest way to do it. I also have details in the description. My email address, direct email address, is DEA.LOTT@cheyoga.org. And so you can find me there. I have an upcoming workshop. The next session starts up toward the end of July, and that'll be the Black and People of Color Spiritual Healing and Activism Workshop. And so I want to say thank you so much, Kaii, for having me on here. I am so, like when you were saying in the beginning that you had noticed my Instagram, and you saw that kind of like the core of like what I was trying to do was coming out. Like you never know for sure how other people are perceiving you. And so that was just such a blessing to hear that like the message is coming through, and that kind of the spiritual focus and the really community oriented work that I'm so devoted to doing, like it shows, and it's pulling people in. And so
it really does. No, thank you. And thank you. And for holding space for people, because even that requires, when you're holding space for other people, you can't not do the work on yourself. Like you can't, like it forces you to continue to do the work so you can hold space for other people.
Yep.
And so that takes work in itself. So I want to say thank you. That does take sacrifice, that takes commitment and dedication. So thank you for continuing to do that, because this work is not easy. It can be draining, exhausting. And there's few people that do it. There's not a lot of people that are actually doing that type of work. So thank you for doing that for our community. It's so appreciated and so needed. So I appreciate that. I'm happy to have you on the podcast. Like I said, I was like writing down, so, for season 2, and then we started talking. I was like, I need her now. Like, this has to happen now. So thank you for working with schedules and allowing this to even happen. I really appreciate that. And so for our listeners, thank you so much for joining. If you are watching this episode on the Healing Element Podcast YouTube channel, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Please be sure to also subscribe and share. If you are listening on the podcast, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or iHeartRadio, please make sure that you download the episode and also subscribe to the podcast. So thank you all for watching. If you want to learn more about me and my services, please check out my website at kaiimarie.com. You all have a phenomenal, phenomenal day, and I will check in soon. Bye-bye.